Example number 2 focuses on students and their interactions with the learning management system. In this example, we have a little over 32,000 students across 22 courses, 173,000 assessments, and more than 10 million interactions with the learning management system on a daily basis. This comes via the Open University Learning Analytics dataset as shown below. No changes were made to the data, but how we chose to relate it in Tableau may be a little bit different than what is shown in the article. So let's have a look at what this dataset looks like at a summary level. The authors of the dataset were kind enough to provide an entity relationship diagram. This can help us understand how the different tables interact with each other. For our starting point, just about everything flows from our student information. In order to have a learning management system, we basically need students. Otherwise, there's kind of no point. We won't spend too much time on the entity relationship diagram, but the important pieces are how the relationships work. So for example, if we look at the path between student info and student registration, what these symbols mean is that for each student in our data, they may have one or many records in the student registration table. Those records, in turn, can tie back to specific courses. In this data set, courses contain a module and a presentation code as their unique identifier. There are other relationships as well. So we can see that student info relates to student assessment. And we can see that student info relates to student VLE. VLE in this context is virtual learning environment. I'm going to call it a learning management system for the duration of the video. There are a number of other tables in here as well, which we can see the relationships of. So from here, let's have a look at how we'd set this up in Tableau, what it would look like using the old data model, and what it would look like using the new data model. So what we see pretty commonly is starting with a simple question. A really good simple question for a data set like this might be, how many students do we have? And from there, we want to build out our analysis to get into progressively more detail. Maybe we want to know how many students are in each course. And then as we work our way down the stack, maybe we want to know how many assessments there are within all the courses and so on. But often analysts start at a high level in higher education. So let's see how this looks in Tableau. We'll start with the old data model. This is Tableau version 2019.4. It was released before the new data model was available. We're going to look at it first. So I want to answer a simple question like, how many students do I have? One thing I'll do in advance is I'm going to turn on the performance recording for my workbook. This will answer a couple questions later for us. So first, I'm going to connect to my student info file by dragging it onto Tableau. I can see some information about all my students, such as the region that they're from, their highest education completed, the age band, number of attempts, and so on. And I can go to sheet number 1, and the quickest way to answer my question is to double-click on number of records, and I can turn on the label just so we can see it. So we've got 32,593 records in this data set. The other way that I can answer how many students is to look at the count distinct. If I drag the ID student and hold down the Option key on a Mac or Control key on a PC, I will get this dialog popping up, or not. I can instead change the measure to count distinct. In this case, what I can see is that there are 28,785 unique records in this data set, not 32,000 odd. However, for our comparison purposes, we can just look at the 32,000 odd. Okay, so that answers our question for how many students. I'll name my worksheet just so that we can see this a little bit easier later. I'm now looking at Tableau version 2020.3. I'm first going to turn on the performance recording so that I can see some things later. I'm now going to connect to my student info file, just as I did before. Here, I can see that the interface is a little bit different, but that the data that I'm connecting to is actually the same. To answer our simple question first, let's just go to sheet number 1, as we did in the old data model. First, I notice that number of records is not available anymore. It's been replaced to an extent by the student info count field. So let's use that one. I'll double click on that and turn on the labels, and I can see that I have the same 32,593. If I wanted to do count distinct, the process is the same as in the old data model. So this is working pretty well. We'll call this how many students. So that worked pretty well. But what if we want to know how many assessments they had? So I'm going to move this one onto the right and the old data model onto the left, and let's modify these to figure out the assessments part of the equation. So now we're getting into a little bit more detailed analysis. It's no longer student level, but student and assessment level. So I'll double click on my data source, and I'm going to first join to student assessment. Tableau probably guessed correctly at the join between student info and student assessment, but you can double check that it is in fact student ID, just to be on the safe side. Next, we want to join to our assessments table. This will give us a little bit more information about the assessments, such as what date they were from and what type they were, so that those of us who aren't as familiar with this learning management system have a sense of what's going on. So I'll drag this onto the canvas, and Tableau is going to take a guess at the kind of join that I want. Unfortunately, I actually want to relate assessments back to student assessment, so Tableau guessed incorrectly because of fields that were named the same. So for these purposes, I'm going to change my join to be based on ID assessment rather than on code module. And now I can see them all joined all the way across. I'm going to do the same with the new data model, using relationships instead. So I'm going to drag student assessment onto the canvas, and I can see that Tableau guessed correctly at the relationship between the two tables. I'm next going to join the assessments file on. Now here I get a bit of a choice. So depending on where I drag my mouse, I can relate it to different tables easily. You can also change this after the fact, of course. But for ease, I'm going to relate it to student assessment directly. And I can see here that Tableau correctly interpreted that ID assessment is the common key between the two tables. So that saved me a step. So now let's go to our worksheets and see how this worked out. I can see in the one on the left that I have 207,000 records now, versus the one on the right, I have only 32,593. So why do we have these different results? Well, for this, we can actually go back to the presentation itself to talk about the theory first, and then we'll show it in Tableau. So joins combine two input tables, and they create a third table, essentially as a flat file. So in this example, we have table A and table B. Those get joined together based on some common key, and they result in a table C. Relationships, on the other hand, depend heavily on what is on your view as to how many tables will be brought in. So this is more complicated than the example that we're looking at live. But imagine that our relationship, the main table on the left, was based on table A, B, and C. And we only used fields from A and B on our canvas. Tables D, E, and F are part of the relationship, but they're not used for anything. Relationships are more flexible than joins, in a nutshell. So back in Tableau, let's see how this works. We'll go to both versions. What we're going to do here is we're going to force Tableau to go back to our data set and add a little bit more information so that we can see the results in the performance recording that's been running for a while now. So what we want to focus on is continuing to use information only from the student info table for now. So let's say I want to know by age band how many students I have. If I put age band onto the canvas in both cases, I get a different number of results, as kind of expected at this point. So let's stop our performance recording. First, we're going to focus on the old data model. We'll click on the Help menu and we'll go to Settings and Performance, and then we'll say Stop Performance Recording. Momentarily, a new workbook will open. This will have some additional information for what's going on behind the scenes in Tableau. So let's look at the old data model first, then we'll come back to the new one. There's a slider located up at the top here. Best to make sure that it says 0.0 seconds because this is a pretty fast data set, so you might otherwise miss your executing query part. So in particular, we want to look for pieces that are green. Lots of stuff that Tableau is doing behind the scenes. So let's go to the individual worksheet for now, and we will filter based on event. And in this case, we're only going to keep the executing query because that's the part that we really want to know about. So now we go back to our dashboard. Now that I've filtered just to the executing query component that matters most to me, I can click on any of these bars and see what Tableau is doing. It's executed a number of queries based on different ways that I've formatted my data and different questions that I've asked of it and different pieces that are in rows, columns, or marks. We'll just pick the first one for sake of argument and have a look at what it does. So what we can see here in the query box is Tableau's telling us what SQL it's running in the background. Now, it doesn't fit particularly well in this dashboard, because it's a reasonably large data set with a number of fields. So what I found is easier is to select all the data by going to View Data, selecting it here, and then hitting Copy, and moving it into a text editor that's designed for the purpose. So what I can see on the left here is what Tableau is doing. In particular, I'll draw your attention to a couple of important pieces. So we've got the From part of our SQL here, and it's looking at the student info table. But I can also see here an inner join to the student assessments table. Now remember, we haven't actually used the student assessments table for anything at this point. It's not on our view in any way. So let's go back to Tableau 2020.3 and see what's happened there instead. I'll turn off my performance recording and I'll get a similar workbook. We'll go through the same kind of steps. I'm going to go to my events sorted by timeline, and I'm going to filter it to keep only the executing query. And I'm going to adjust my elapsed time back down to the smallest number that Tableau can make available for me. And now if I click on my first bar as an example, I can right-click and view data just as I did before, and I can copy this into the SQL editor. What I can see here is that Tableau has imported much less information. In fact, only the information that I need. In this case, it's importing from the Tableau temp student info table, as expected. Notice that there's no inner join to the assessments table, even though we have a relationship to that table. Now, we can verify this with our other queries as well. So just for completeness here, I can click on my other queries, and I see that this one is only student info, and this one's only student info. The point here is that no matter what we're doing, even when we added an age band, as we see here, Tableau's only querying from the student info table, because all the fields that we have, which in our case is a simple count of records or sum and age band, are all from the same table. So Tableau's not hitting our database where all our assessment information is living, because it doesn't need it. It's only trying to answer how many students do we have grouped by age band. So the new data model is much more efficient from a database management perspective because it only leverages the tables that are required for its purposes. This will make your database administrator happy, typically, because it means that you're not creating these massive files that you really don't actually need. And you're not going back to the database for tons and tons of information that you're not actually using. So it's very efficient from that perspective. That's all we'll do for now on performance recording, but I'd encourage you to dig into it more deeply as you compare the performance of the two data models. It can be really informative as to what's happening behind the scenes in Tableau. Now that we've seen how the new data model works, we can build out the rest of our data set so that we can answer additional questions further down the line. Looking back at our database schema, entity relationship diagram, we can see some of the pieces that we're missing here. We're just going to make changes now in the new version of Tableau because we've seen the power of the new data model. So let's see how we can set the rest of this up. I'll double click on my data source. I'll make that a little bit bigger so that you can see it. And then we'll begin adding the additional pieces. So the first one that we want to add is student VLE. This relates to the student info table based on the ID of the student, as well as the code module and code presentation. We can then relate that to VLE itself, which is based on code module and code presentation, as well as the ID of the site. Then add student registration based on module presentation and ID. Last but not least, we can add courses in here. This can tie either to registration or to VLE, depending on how we're choosing to use it. For this purpose, I'm going to relate it to registration. And it's based on module and presentation. We can now build out a series of dashboards based on this data. Back on our worksheet, we can now use the new data model to test how we've done in terms of bringing in the correct number of records for each of the key questions that we want to answer. So I'll make a new worksheet. Let's walk through this one really quickly. Here's an example where measure values might be really helpful to us. So I'm going to double click on that, and I'm going to remove fields that aren't quite what I'm looking for. So as a starting point, I'm going to remove all of the sums. And then I'll rotate this, and I'll put some labels on so that we can see things a little bit easier. And I'll sort it just based on size. So I can see that we've got a little over 10 million entries from the student VLE table, which is what we expected at the beginning. We've then got 173,912 student assessments, 32,593 from both student info and student registration, which was expected, 206 individual kinds of assessments, and 22 courses. This is a really quick way for us to get a sense of how much information is coming from the different tables. All of these count fields that you can see here show up at the bottom of each of our tables. For example, student registration that we see here ties to student registration that we see here. Same for student info here and here, and so on. So this is a really high-level way to get a sense of what's in our data. We now have independent counts from each of our tables, which means that we're not getting duplicate or missing entries. We can then go on and build a series of more advanced dashboards to help answer more of our questions, but this is a great starting point. We know we have the right data and that it's accurate based on our understanding of the data set.